here today. We are collaborating with the Ohio State University Extension Office to bring you a very exciting webinar series about living your best garden life. And today is our first of that series, kicking off spring gardens and kind of what to get started with now. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We will be using the Q&A feature during the webinar. Chat is disabled, so please feel free to type your questions in as we go along. There will be time at the end reserved for us to cover as much as we can. We might be able to extend that time a little bit as well. So before we get going, I'm going to give a little bit of background about the Nature Conservancy, and then I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today, and for the rest of this series, and our co-host, Tim McDermott. All right, hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. So I'm Angie Burke. I am the Conservation and Community Engagement Specialist here with the Nature Conservancy in Ohio. And if you're not familiar with who the Nature Conservancy is, we got a quick presentation to walk you through it. We are one of the leading conservation nonprofits that works globally. We have more than 60 years of success, and we've been named as the Environmental Brand of the Year, with over 1 million dedicated members, 3,600 conservationists, over 1,300 volunteer leaders, 400 scientists. We're in all 50 states and over 79 countries. We really do have a lasting impact. Our vision and mission at the Nature Conservancy is a world where the diversity of life thrives and people act to conserve nature for its own sake and its ability to fulfill our needs and enrich our lives. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. So from the halls of Congress to the Amazon forest, TNC can connect you to places and people around the world. Here's just a quick map of where we work and some of our impacts around the world. And like I said, there's over 79 countries and territories that we work to help promote conservation. A little bit more about our goals and our work. We do have these 2030 goals that the whole organization is working towards. It involves tackling carbon emissions, saving healthy lands for a healthier planet, helping people to on the front lines of our climate crisis, deepening solutions for our ocean, conserving world's freshwater, and working alongside local leaders who are lighting the way. And with that, I would like to introduce our co-host and guest speaker today, Tim McDermott from the Ohio State University Ag Extension. We're really honored to be having this series and bringing it to you all today. So go ahead whenever you're ready, Tim. We're going to just drop a couple of links in the chat to everyone so you can find out more about the Nature Conservancy as well.
Thanks, Angie. I am so happy to be here. They plowed my community garden last night, so I am ready to plant. So today what we're going to do is we are going to get you started onboarding so that you can live your best garden life in 2023. And we're going to start with the spring, and then we're going to be doing classes in summer, and we're going to do classes in fall. So my goal when I engage is I want to engage with success right off the bat. We're going to have some of what I would consider the basics to start. If you are a seasoned gardener, I want to make sure that we find some pearls of knowledge in there. And like Angie said, we will have time for questions at the end. So I work for Ohio State University. I don't have as cool as slides as Angie by any means, but what we do at Ohio State Extension is we are the outreach arm of the university. We satisfy the land grant mission of the university. In Ohio, we have an office in all 88 counties. I am an agriculture and natural resources extension educator. I'm in Franklin County. So if you are in a different county in Ohio and you want to find your county educator, the way you find him is countyname.osu.edu. So if you lived in Cleveland, it would be cuyahoga.osu.edu. Knowing we have a national reach of people that are on here, you have a land grant university in all 50 states. And so regardless of where you are at, if you want to get a hold of your extension educator, you should be able to find that by searching for the extension in your state. All right. So how do you grow? I grow in multiple different methods. Like I said, my community garden was just plowed last night. They got it in because we got about 10 of the next 12 days of rain coming, and they needed to get that ground prepared before it became too soggy. Because we have pretty heavy clay here, and if they tore it up and it dried and it was wet, we would have some serious clods. That is my garden on the right side. I am going into my 27th year as a community gardener in one of three remaining actual victory gardens in the United States. On the bottom left, that is where I work. And I have a tiny little demonstration garden that I have raised beds in. I use that mostly for digital content creation. Some of the pictures that we'll see today were shot in that garden. And then at my house, the reason I community garden is I have deep shade under walnuts, maples, and hackberries. So the only sun that I get is a little bit of sun on my driveway. So I will garden in a container. So if you have questions about how you want to get started, realize you have options for growing. We can garden and we can get sizable production even in just a container as long as you size your containers and you go big. So when I am taking a look at what I'm going to do, I started making my plans uh, probably a month or so, 2 months ago, on what I wanted to plant for this year because I start seeds indoors. And what I always do is I try to figure out what I liked last year that I'm going to keep and what I disliked from last year I'm going to get rid of because I try to do at least one new thing every year. And so, for example, in the top left, I grew corn last year. I'm not going to grow corn for the next 9 years. And the reason is it takes me 10 years to forget how much I hate growing sweet corn because it takes so much work. And then the animals eat all of my stuff. And a picture that I have in the middle here, that's my forever pea. I find my new forever pea. I love snap peas, and I've always grown sugar snaps. I tried a variety last year that I love. They're called Sugar Ann, and they're a dwarf sugar snap pea. And then I'm going to go big on my onion family. I love growing onions, and I am going to make sure that I have onions for days. I also like to use season extension, and I'm going to go big on season extension as well. So you're thinking about starting your best garden life. How do you get started? So I will tell you this right off the bat. Vegetables, fruits, and herbs require full sun to maximize their production. You want a south face if you're in the northern hemisphere, like I am up here in Ohio. You want to avoid trees. You want to avoid buildings. You want to be about 3 times away from something as it is tall to minimize your shade impacts because maximal sun is what we like to have when we're growing for food production. But a lot of people say to me, they're like, Tim, that's great, but I don't have full sun. I grow on the side of my garage. Maybe I have an east side face. Maybe I got a west face. What do I do? Because I still want to grow. And so what I tell folks is if you don't have full sun, what we use is the concept of right plant in the right place, meaning that if you wanted to grow tomatoes, everybody wants to grow tomatoes. I grow tomatoes. If I'm growing tomatoes and I have full sun, I can grow anything. If I'm growing tomatoes and maybe I have a half a day on the side of my house, I need to make wise choices with my varietal selection. I'm reading maturation dates. I'm looking to see how long it's going to take for that tomato to ripen. If I'm looking at like an heirloom, like an Oxheart or a Brandywine, they might be 110 days, and that's just too much time with half sun to mature. So if I want to get a tomato and I'm using half day sun, I'm looking for something that matures a little faster. Maybe I'm going with an early girl or a first lady or some of the saladettes like Juliet or any of the cherry tomatoes. There's varieties of tomato that will ripen in as quick as say 52, 55 days. Pretty much any of the cool season vegetables that we have here, maybe not all of them, I wouldn't say Brussels sprouts, but a good chunk of the leafy brassicas and a lot of the leafy greens, they're used to not having a tremendous amount of sun. They are able to be matured right now. Those would also be good choices to grow if you only had part sun. And then quite honestly, most of the herbs are going to do just fine if you only have a half day sun. But that's how you would maximize your production and you would enable success right off the bat. And then evaluate where your water is because that's very important because depending on how hot it gets in the summer, you may need to be pouring water on your plants. Normal amount of water that we would water vegetables with is about 1 inch of rain per square foot, but that weighs about 5 pounds. That's over a half a gallon. If you have even a 4x4 raised bed, you might actually have to do 80 pounds of water and haul 10 gallons per week. And that might be doubled in hot weather. So try to make sure that when you're picking your site for your new veggie garden, that you get it where you can get water to it. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we sort of spare water. But if you can get it where you have a source of potable water, that's great. Water catchment, I'm not a huge fan of for freshly eaten produce, especially produce we might not cook, because sometimes you might have some contamination from that water catchment. Water catchment, I think, is great for ornamentals or for your lawn and diverting waste or stormwater that way. But for veggies, I really like potable water. And then I tell folks, make sure that when you irrigate your plants, you bottom water them, you soak around the base of the plant, and you don't overhead water like you're mimicking rainfall. While say bok choy or lettuce is not going to have a big problem with it, your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplant, a lot of your cucurbits, that is going to set them up for fungal disease, maybe some of the blights, maybe some of the mildews. They don't like to be wet and humid. They will get fungal disease, and you want to minimize the chance of you making it worse. And then realize, depending on where you grow, your soil type is going to influence how often you have to water. Because if you're in an area that has a really sandy soil, you'll probably have to water more often because it's going to leach out of the root area. If you have heavy clay like I have, I water a little bit less because clay is just going to grab everything and hold on to it for a long time. And then if you want to maximize your success for your food production garden, the best money you will ever spend is getting your soil tested. Your soil test is going to tell you what you have in place, including your pH, and then it's going to give you a recommendation on what you need in order to get maximum harvest, because you want maximum harvest. And every time you pick a tomato or you take a head of lettuce off, you have taken fertility out of the ground. And so you need to provide that. So this is an example of a soil test, and I harvested this myself. This is from a community garden on the east side of Columbus. And if you would have looked at this soil, you would have thought that this was the greatest soil you ever saw. You would have thought that you were going to raise state fair champion vegetables on this. It looked dark and crumbly and rich, but when I ran a soil test on it, it is deficient in the macronutrients needed for plant growth, both phosphorus and potassium. And so what would have happened is I would have planted my veggies in this, and if I didn't soil test and match fertility, I would have grown a bumper crop of weeds, because weeds don't read the soil test and they don't need us to feed them. If we actually feed our veggies what they require, then they stand a pretty good chance of competing against your weeds. So for that $10 to $15 cost, you run a soil test, you address your fertility, you check it every few years to make sure you're maintaining your fertility in your garden. Your veggie plants will thank you, and you will maximize your harvest because you are matching the fertility of what your plants need to their optimal usage. Okay, so then how do you add fertilizer? There's lots of different ways that we can add fertilizer. The common ways would be, most common ways would be we add a granular. That would be a slow acting granular. That could be something like a organic one, like I'm showing you right there, that's a veggie one. That could be an inorganic one, like the kind of fertilizer when we fertilize our lawns. They release slowly, decent sized particle sizes. They might feed for 2 to 3 months or so. I generally incorporate mine when I'm doing my planting. I'll probably side dress or add a little bit more at that 2 or 3 month period, because at that 2 or 3 month period, those plants have been growing for a long time. They are much bigger and they're probably in heavy production. That's when they need a little extra fertilizer. And so you're going to read the label and find out how long it's going to be in the soil, because when it runs out, you don't want your plants to get stressed because there's no more fertilizer in there for them. And then I commonly use water-based, especially if I have something that's only going to be in, say, a month, like lettuce. Water-based is the granules that you mix up in water, and when you water, you fertilize, and so that fertilizer gets delivered right into the root zone when you irrigate, and then it's rapidly available to the plants because there's not a particle that needs breakdown. So like if I'm feeding for a long time, I'm going to use a granular fertilizer. If I'm feeding over a short time, or I need to get some fertility into the space quick, I'll use a water soluble. And then another way that I have used for fertilizing would be foliar. This is one where you actually mix water soluble fertilizer into a spray can and you mist it on the leaves. Now, it's not a perfect feeding system because not every nutrient actually can be taken up by the leaves and be moved within the plants. Only certain ones can. And then keep in mind this as well. Not every veggie is actually going to be amenable to this. If you have a really waxy leaf like an onion or like a broccoli leaf, it's just going to run right off that and you're not going to have any absorption. So while it has its uses in an emergency situation, 99% of my fertilization is going to occur with granular incorporated at planting and a side dress, or if I need to get fertility quick to the roots of the plant, I'm going to do water-based. Okay, now, if you're getting started, this is my favorite method, especially in an urban environment or a small space garden, and it's called the biointensive method. And what it does is it maximizes your soil health to maximize the amount of healthy harvest that you get. That is generally by adding a bunch of compost and organic matter into the soil, as well as doing a few other tools in the toolbox of a grower. I like to use raised beds, and we're going to talk about those a little bit more. And I like to use things like mulch and season extension, which is where I will protect crops from either hot weather or cold weather in order to get a longer harvest. Believe it or not, here in Ohio, and it's probably the same wherever you are, I grow and harvest 12 months of the year. I grow and harvest every single month. I will go to my garden in January. Here in Ohio, we commonly will get a few days in January where it will go to 50 degrees, and I will go out there with scissors and grab some kale or some spinach or something like that. And I do that by using season extension techniques to protect my tender plantings to keep them alive in inclement weather. And because I really like harvesting my own fresh produce for Christmas dinner. And that is what you can do when you do season extension. And then I use the principles of integrated pest management, which means I use lots of little things in order to try to keep the pests, the weeds, the disease, the bugs from eating my stuff. And that means we don't just have only pesticides as an option. We have scouting, and we have protective methods, and we have resistant varieties, and we have lots of little things trying to get to a greater effect. So when we talk about organic matter makes up about 3 to 5% of your soil, but it is the magic 3 to 5%. Roughly 50% of your soil is going to be a 50-50 blend of air and water. You got about 45% in minerals. And if you're lucky, you have about 5% organic matter in your soil. I can't say I'm that lucky. I try to keep mine about 4% or so, but I intensively work my ground, which means I'm constantly burning up my organic matter. We try to build organic matter up when we work our soil. We try to spare organic matter so that we don't lose any organic matter as we do tillage or we work our soil. Great ways to add organic matter would be things like adding leaves. Believe it or not, leaves have a larger amount of nutrients per pound than manure. Leaves basically are the nutrients that a tree takes up when they mine the subsoil in the soil. Then they make leaves, and then they sprinkle it all over your yard as free organic matter. I use my leaves to make my compost, and then I'm an avid composter. My leaves are my carbons, my kitchen scraps are my nitrogens. I will incorporate my compost into my vegetable garden and into my container garden to make sure I'm constantly adding more organic matter back into my system that I burn as I harvest or I work my soil. If you can find a source of manure, great. I actually work on a farm. It's a dairy farm. That's where my building is. So I have a large amount of free organic matter from some colleagues of mine in Buckeye Nation that are very adorable and make very delicious milk. You might have that. Make sure that you follow all the safe guidelines for manure incorporation so that you don't have any pathogens. I like to put mine in the year before and then maybe plant a cover crop on top of it. And that cover crop is going to help keep all of my nutrients in the soil. And then I'll turn that crop back into my soil before I plant. And that is returning a bunch of nutrients. Like I said, I like to grow in raised beds. When we talk about raised beds versus row crops, both of them have some pluses and minuses. But for me, a raised bed is my preferred method of growing because that allows me to concentrate all of my work in a space. A raised bed is just that. It's actually a concept. So in this picture here, you can see that I have a form. Well, I built a raised bed up. Raised beds about 4 feet wide is the max I would recommend because you don't want to have to step in them. That way you never compact your soil, and that soil then becomes really loose and friable, and that allows your plants to grow a dynamic and large root volume. And that dynamic and large root volume is going to help them grow better because plants take up their air, their water, and their nutrition through their roots in the soil. So nice healthy roots, nice healthy plant. One of the great things about it is they drain good. And since we're going to have 10 days of rain upcoming, I'm going to need some drainage in my raised beds. And then they warm up faster in cold weather, which will allow me to get in and plant. Now, keep in mind, in a hot summer day, that's working against you because they drain faster, dry out faster, and get hotter faster. And working in an urban environment, I'm in a city, Columbus, Ohio, 14th largest in the nation. We do have outsized climate impacts on how hot we get in our cities. We're going to be 10 or 20 degrees hotter in the city than we would be out in the country 30 minutes away. So we have to make sure that we factor that in when we plant, how we do our season extension, and even our varietals anymore. With my tomatoes, I've started adding a hot weather tolerant tomato into my rotation because when it gets 90 degrees, I want to still be eating tomatoes. Row crops are commonly used for people to grow. They were actually developed much later than raised bed growing, and that was to facilitate planting large plantings of monocrops that would be planted the same way, fertilized the same way, weeded the same way, harvest the same way, and then you could use mechanization to do that. I am a bigger fan of raised beds than row crops because when you have a row crop and you walk between the rows, you are actually walking on the roots and you are compacting that soil. And as we just talked about, you want that dynamic large root volume in your soil. And if you're compacting the soil, you're not allowing that to take place. But like I said, it's not needed to have a form. A raised bed garden is a concept. So that is my garden when it's looking really nice, which it does for about 5 minutes before the deer eat everything down. But what I do is I have raised bed technique, and where the tractor went through with the rototiller last night, they made a nice raised bed, and then where the tires compacted is where I have my pathways, and I use my garden rake and I shape it about 3 inches tall, and then I follow all of the raised bed techniques planting in those spaces. Now, if you're going to use a form, and this is important, and I really like using a form because it can give you some height, especially like in this case, this is a picture of a set of raised beds on a land bank property in Columbus, Ohio. So we had to go up in the air a little bit with our soil because the soil underneath it was fill dirt from when they remediated a property on this space. And that soil is not always the best dirt for growing. It still allows drainage, and we can amend it over time. But if we go up in the air, we can start growing right away. Keep in mind that if you're growing up in the air and you have a form, you need to replace probably 20% of the volume of your soil back into that raised bed each year because you eat it. Every time you harvest something, you're taking soil out. And so each year, I recommend to folks at the beginning, before you plant, make sure that you top off your raised beds, get everything incorporated in there. And then if you need to soil test, you soil test that so that you know what you have going forward and you can get started living your best spring garden life right away. All right, let's talk about vegetable families because veggies have families. They have cousins, they have brothers and sisters. And this is important because when we want to use the concept of crop rotation, which is a huge tool in the toolbox of a grower, we want to make sure that we are ideally not growing veggies from the same vegetable family in the same space without separating that by about 3 years. Because if you grow them in the same space year after year, you select for pests, weeds, and disease that affect those vegetable families, and pests, weeds, and disease affect members of the different vegetable families similarly. So if you're growing tomatoes in a raised bed, ideally you would put them in a different raised bed and then not come back to that first raised bed for 3 years. And you would do the same with your peppers because they're cousins. So if you plant tomatoes in a spot and next year you plant peppers in the spot, you haven't crop rotated, you've selected for disease. And so I recommend that you chart stuff. And I took this picture of a buddy's chart system because I thought this was awesome. And I'm an analog dude. I like pencils and I like writing stuff down. But anymore, I just don't remember where all my stuff is. And so what I use to chart my crop rotation option is my phone. I take pictures of my garden frequently, and the cool thing about my phone is it stores those pictures. It will put them in the folder for me. It charts the location and the time that I did that, and then that allows me to do crop rotation, which is 3 years between spots if possible. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Tim, hey, that's great. I would love to crop rotate, but I have one bed. I have one 4x4 bed, and I want to plant tomatoes in that bed every year because tomatoes are my favorite. So what do you do? And what I tell folks is you go ahead and you plant your tomatoes. The thing that we would do is let's use all of the tools in our toolbox in order to make sure that those tomatoes are living their best garden life. Since we know we have a risk of disease, let's make sure that we fertilize so that the tomatoes get the fertilizer based on a soil test guidance, so they will be their healthiest self. Let's make sure that we add organic matter so we have healthy soil, which leads to a healthy plant. Let's put some mulch down in there, and let's try to put a barrier between the fungal disease in the soil and splashing up onto those leaves. And then let's make a wise choice with our varietal selection. If we're going to be growing and selecting for disease, let's try to find a variety that has heavy disease resistance. And let's try to make sure we're using all the little tools in our toolbox so that we can try to get the best harvest that we can get. So, containers. I grow in containers, and I recommend that if you don't have your own community garden space or your own back 40, try to find that spot where you can grow in containers, because I find it's very worthwhile to do so. And the reason is you can now get containers that will fit on any space. So this is a picture of my container garden, and it is on my driveway. And in the back row, there's these 3 giant plastic containers, and I got them for $1 a piece at a yard sale, and I will never find that deal ever again for the rest of my life. But I love them. And what I do to supplement them is I use grow bags. So grow bags in the front row there are an innovation out of the nursery and landscape industry. And they're basically felt bags, and they come anywhere from small to giant. Those are 30-gallon grow bags. And I have a dozen heads of lettuce growing in the bottom right one. That's a good amount of space. I've seen grow bags that unfold into a 4x4 raised bed that's 12 inches tall. So you can put these on places like gravel or your driveway, and you can grow even if you don't have soil, if you can find sun. In fact, I grow on my driveway starting about September and grow until May because my driveway is way too hot to grow in the summer. And when I start losing leaves in my backyard, all of a sudden I get more sun in the fall. And so my 2 primary gardens that I grow in are my container garden on my driveway, and I grow in my community garden. And they play really well with each other because one of them does great in the warm weather and one of them does great in the cold weather. They're going to basically come through with the bush hog, and they're going to mow everything down around November 1st at my community garden. But that is when my container garden is shining. It does great over winter. I use season extension, but I got black containers on a driveway next to my garage, next to my house. I have a micro environment that captures heat during the day, and it radiates that heat back out into the space. And so I've grown spinach over winter in containers. I got baby radishes in the bottom left. I got bok choy in the top left. I've got romaine and kale growing in the top right. All those delicious leafy greens can be grown very, very well overwintered in containers. I'll be honest, spinach and bok choy are bomb proof. You throw some row cover over those. I've overwintered spinach and kale under row cover even through the year when we had 2 polar vortexes in that same year. All right, so as a gardener, I'm a planner. I like to see what's coming. And so I evaluate using the National Weather Service's temperature and precipitation outlook, and that guides my planting. Because if I see something coming, I want to know, do I need to go big or do I need to back off a little bit? So this was made just the other day. This is a nationwide thing. And so like here in Ohio, we have a decent chance of warmer weather and maybe a little bit of a higher chance of precipitation. And I'm fine with that because I want to have some warm weather in April, because out in my garden right now, I have peas planted and radishes planted and lettuce planted and spinach planted and kale planted and cilantro planted. And when it's warm weather, I mean, it's not going to be 90. It's just going to minimize some of the frost and freeze overnight. Those plants can take it, but they would prefer if it stays about 50 or 60 degrees with a bunch of rain. When we look at our 3-month, it's showing me more of the same. It's going to be warm all the way till we get through spring, and they're showing me probably May and June is going to be wet, and April is too. If you saw my weather, and I think I even have my weather, you're going to see some rain, rain, rain. They just came out with the new USDA plant hardiness zones. So you can take a look wherever you are in the United States and you can see where you kind of have your frost worries and your temperature maximum lows. And what we're seeing by global climate change is it's slowly warming in most places. Ohio is actually predicted to have the same climate as Arkansas in the next 20, 30, 40 years or something like that. And so I keep telling my wife, we don't need to move south. The South is moving north and meeting us up here. We can stay in Ohio. So then, as a grower, I'm always looking at these two things. On the right, that is my weather prediction for the next 2 weeks. I'm not super excited about it, but if I was ahead of bok choy, I would be absolutely ecstatic looking at that because I love those temperatures. I'm going to have a little row cover over top of me to protect if any frosts come, even though I don't mind frost. And I like all of that rain. And I use that to guide not only what I plant, because the water is not turned on at my community garden right now. It won't get turned on until freeze warnings go past. So I need Mother Nature to help me out a little bit with irrigation. But I also watch it if I need to work my soil. Because if you have heavy clay soil, like I mentioned earlier, and it is soaking wet, you do not want to get in there with the rototiller because you will crush that soil, compact it, and it will dry into bricks. And then the other thing that I watch very, very closely is on the left, and that is the soil temperature. When we talk about plants and temperature, we talk about the outside air temperatures and things with frosts and freezes, but when I plant a seed or I put a transplant in the ground, they're going to live in the soil. I need to find out my soil temperatures. And quite honestly, our soil temperatures here at the Columbus Station, which is Waterman Farm on the campus of The Ohio State University, we got some cold soil. We were 20 something degrees the last few nights. We were 19 the other day. So even though we have some warm up coming today and tomorrow, I don't want to rush stuff out. All of the things that I have in the ground right now are under pre-warmed raised beds that have row cover on them. And so my soil temperature is a little bit warmer. If you want to know your soil temperature, I recommend you get one of the digital oven thermometers and you get out there and you measure it at 5 centimeters, which is 2 inches, and 4 centimeters, or 10 centimeters, which is 4 inches, because that is where your seed and that is where your baby transplant zone is going to be. I would like them to be above 50. So see if your soil, wherever you are, is above 50, and that's a little safer, definitely than 43. Okay, I'm a seed starter. I'm a huge seed starter. I like to start my own seeds. I have a link at the very end to my website, and I have full classes on container gardening and seed starting and everything on that website. We won't go too far in depth in it today because it's its own whole 1-hour class. But if you want to grow whatever you want to grow and you want to grow it when you want to grow it, all the seeds in the catalog are at your disposal when you learn how to seed start. The key thing to have is a grow light. You need a grow light because you're mimicking the sun. Sunny windowsills, don't cut it. You will frustrate the heck out of yourself if you try to germinate seeds in Ohio in a sunny windowsill in February. They will be unhappy. In Ohio right now, seed starting indoors, pretty much from top to bottom, a lot of your leafy greens, a bunch of your brassicas, and a bunch of your onions. And I'm going to do a little bit of a caveat with that, meaning that it would have been better to start your cauliflower, your Brussels sprouts, your cabbage, and your broccoli probably about 3 weeks ago in order to get them out in about 2 or 3 weeks. But if you wanted to start some and you had a fast maturing variety, then go ahead and go for it. And you're probably fine with your Brussels sprouts because you're not going to harvest those things till October, November anyhow. The other ones, you can direct seed some of these. I already started my onions. And so if you haven't started these and you're not going to be able to start them right now, I would probably be looking for plants at the nursery, garden store, or online for some of the ones in the middle here. Right now, I got growing a bunch of lettuces and I got a bunch of brassicas growing. This is plantings that will be transplanted outside. Generally, what I do is plant a rotation of them. So you see a flat and you see a billion heads of bok choy and a billion heads of lettuce right here. This is going to be for different projects I have at work. Me starting them at home, I do probably 2 6-packs every couple of weeks. I like to succession plant a lot because I don't want 50 heads of lettuce at the same time. I want 1 head of lettuce every 3 days for most of the year. That is what I like to grow. And because I start my own seeds, I can do that. That is the power of seed starting. Okay. Outdoors, direct planting in your soil. If your soil is warm enough, getting closer to 50 degrees, although quite honestly, a lot of these cold weather ones can tolerate a 45-degree soil, you're going to be looking to start all of the ones that we had gone inside for the most part. In terms of the brassicas, I'd stick to the leafy brassicas, bok choy, and your collards and your mustards and your kales and things like that. But also lettuce and spinach and arugula, your tap-rooted stuff, carrots, radishes, beets, and turnips are going to go out. Potatoes would go out as seed potatoes, which means you're either going to plant a small potato or you're going to cut a large potato into sections where you have an eye in each section and allow that to dry out and cure before you plant those. Your peas are going out soon. I planted peas today. They're under row cover. My soil's a little pre-warmed. That could be shell peas. That could be your snap peas. Swiss chard, a relative of beets, does great in the cold weather, does great in the hot weather. That is one I like to get out there. And then onions are my favorite vegetable to grow and eat. I have started some in seed, but you can also find at whatever nursery and greenhouse that you like to shop at, either sets or transplants. And folks will ask me, well, should I do a set or should I do a transplant? And I say, either one of them is going to work if you pick the correct daylight length need of your onions. And here's what I mean by that. I am in Ohio in the northern hemisphere, so I grow long day onions. I could get by with day neutral onions. If I was in the south, I would plant short day onions, right? So here in Columbus, Ohio, I'm looking for Walla Walla onions. If I want a big long day onion, right? That's Walla Walla, Washington. If I was down south, I would probably look at a Vidalia, right? Vidalias grow better in the south. They're a short day onion. And what that means is they're induced to form a bulb based on daylight length. And what we have is rapidly increasing sunlight that occurs in May and June. And that is going to make my onions bulb up into nice big onions. What you find sometimes if you grow a onion variety in a different location than what it's supposed to be, you just don't get the size that you would want. And sometimes they even bolt or send up their seed head because they're stressed. And then I plant more. Like I was saying, I don't want 500 radishes at once. I want 5 radishes every 2 days for about 6 to 8 weeks. And so I plant more of these things. My lettuces, my radishes, turnips. I like the little Hackuri turnips. If anybody's had those, they're white, about the size of a golf ball, and they're really sweet. And then I do spinach, carrots. I am going to plant, things like basil 3 times a year, kale multiple times. When you get a packet of seed, you get a packet of lettuce seed, there's like 200 seeds in there. Make sure that you plant. I tell folks, vegetables cost money, seeds are cheap. Plant away, plant all your seeds. One thing that I have periodically is I go through my seed bin and there's a packet that's still got half the seeds in it and it's 5 years old and those seeds aren't viable anymore and I wish I would have planted them. So get stuff in the ground. But when you get them in the ground, if you've planted thickly, like I sometimes do, make sure that you thin them so that they have the appropriate amount of space to turn into what they would wish to turn into in their new forever home. So here's a row of radishes that are planted, and I need to make sure that I thin them because if I don't, I'm going to have a lot of radish tops and I'm not going to have radishes. So I might start with them right here and they're all on top of each other. This is actually pretty good for me. I kind of have a heavy hand when I plant for whatever reason, but I'm thinning them to try to get them to every 2 or 3 inches so that I get a nice row of radishes. Okay. Whether you grew them yourself under your grow lights, or you bought them online and they were shipped to you, or you go to the nursery and you find them for sale, we have our transplanting, at least here in Ohio, going to occur soon. And if you're able to use a season extension to either pre-warm or keep them warm, right now we are going to be transplanting outside lettuce, celery, Swiss chard, and then all the brassicas. This is spring vegetable planting season, and we're going to go hot and heavy on those things. I really enjoy growing a lot of my own brassicas. You know, I used to get grossed out by that cabbage, imported cabbage worm. That's the larval form of the cabbage white butterfly. It is the most common butterfly here in Ohio, and it really grosses me out when I go to eat broccoli and then I put the broccoli head in water and a bunch of worms float to the surface. And then I'm like, I'm not going to touch broccoli for about 6 years. But there's nice products that are out there now that are very effective and organic with a very short post-harvest interval. Products containing spinosad have really revolutionized my brassica game, where I can keep them protected from pests without having a big batch of residue or a long post-harvest interval. Seed starting indoors right now, if depending on where you're at, right this minute is a great time to start your nightshade family, the Solanaceae, your tomatoes, your eggplant, your peppers. Those right now I've already started and I'm looking at them to my left. I have my peppers are coming up and my eggplants coming up. And this weekend I will start my tomatoes indoor under my grow lights. I don't know if you guys can see. I got a little hydro unit behind me, but there, glowing like the sun, is my peppers in the container with a grow light on top of them. And they're starting to come up and they look pretty good. I will take the humidity dome off probably in the next day or so because I don't want fungal disease, too high of humidity. I want good humidity for germination, and then I want healthy plants going forward. And then I have lettuce bok choy down here because I like to start more of them. I prefer to grow my lettuce and my bok choy and put them out as transplants to grow to a head. But if I didn't have a grow light, I would be fine sprinkling them outside and thinning them, and either doing them as cut and come again or doing them as a letting them be thinned and turn into a head. And then I'll start my cucurbits soon. I'm not going to start them right now simply because they would just get too big before they would go outside, right? Because these warm season crops here in central Ohio, they're not going outside until the end of May, quite honestly, because it is going to be too cold for them to go outside for the most part. I don't like to rush them out. They like warm soil. They want to go in soil that is at least 70 degrees. And if they go into too cool soil, they can suffer. But cucurbits grow really, really fast under the lights. And then they start putting out really big leaves. And I just don't have enough light space for that. And pretty soon I'm going to start scouting, right? Integrated pest management means we want to identify the presence of pests before they build up to an unacceptable level and an infestation, because you can get rid of a few, but it's hard to get rid of an infestation. One of the first pests that I have, and they start to eat stuff, including this picture I took of them eating my radishes, is slugs. If you are pumping the organic matter in and your compost and you have a rich, crumbly organic matter soil in your raised beds, you are going to have slugs because they love this. Slugs are equal opportunity pests. They will eat any number of your stuff. But again, slugs don't super bother me if I identify them and get them before there's a lot of them, because there's great products for control of slugs that break down into fertilizer. Things that have iron phosphate in them is what you would look like to do that. And then if I'm thinking about my perennials, so I stuck this in here because if depending on where you're located, you might want to put things like fruit in, or asparagus or rhubarb. And spring is a great planting time for our perennials, whether it's going to be, a raspberry bush or it's going to be an asparagus patch. Perennial planting checklists. I think perennials are harder to maintain than annuals. You definitely need to do a better job with your site prep. Your site selection is similar to, like we talked about, tons and tons of sun, but your weed remediation has to be great. And in fact, you need to make sure you take care of all of them in there. That might take a year. It might take 2 years if it's really weedy, but you don't want to put your perennials in a weedy place, because then you're not going to be able to effectively deal with those weeds. Then we go through the similar stuff that we talked about with our fertility and organic matter. Depending on what you grow, you're going to want to do a varietal selection that does best in your location. okay? Because there are certain plants that simply grow better in better locations. So this is my work. That's my work address. I soil tested. I'm putting in asparagus in my demo plot. It told me that I needed to put a bunch of soil amendment of fertilizer in there because my phosphorus and my potassium were down. And so what I did is I walked over to some of my coworkers at Buckeye Nation and I asked them if I could get some fertilizer for them, and they were down with helping me. And I hauled 6 buckets of dairy manure and I incorporated it in there, and no weeds, rototilled it in, planted my asparagus, and I have a dynamite asparagus patch growing right now in my garden. And so if you're going to put some perennials in there, make sure that you are really intentional about how well you prep that space. And on that note, I'm going to let Angie do some housekeeping notes for you guys, and then feel free to dump some Q&A in for me, and we will get to the questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. I have learned so much, and I realize my task list for my garden is a lot bigger than I thought it was to get started. Thank you so much for all of that great advice. Everyone, please feel free to flood the question and answer section. We'll be answering some of these live. We're going to drop some links in the chat again. We'll drop the link to the OSU Growing Franklin that you see up there, so you can easily copy and paste that. And we'll also give you more information about how to register for our next Living Your Best Garden Life. That'll be focused on summer gardens. So we'll drop a link in the chat for you to register for that if you haven't already, and how you can get more information about both organizations and how to live your best garden life. Like you said, Tim, there's just so much to learn about this, so it's really exciting. And our first question that came in was about grow lights and how close should they be to seedlings. The grow lights say 12 inches, but that seems too far.
All right, I got
advice?
the Q&A pulled up, Angie. I am going to start flying through these questions.
All
We got
right.
some great questions already. So Sherry, how close should grow lights be to seedlings? I would say, one, I'll be honest, it really depends on the grow light. Some of them are more powerful, some of them are less powerful. So if you're going to get a grow light, the first thing I recommend is make sure it is labeled for vegetables. And then ideally, you would be guided by a light meter. But if you are finding that your grow lights at 12 inches and your plants are leggy, then you need to move that closer to the plants. If it is a grow light not putting out a lot of heat, you can get it as close as 2 or 3 inches. And then evaluate how long your timer is on, because you might find that you need to set it for 15 or 16 hours. If you have a grow light that is, maybe closer to like a compact fluorescent bulb or something like that, I'd say 2 or 3 inches away from the seedling, and I would roll that rascal for about 16 hours on the timer. So how should we still get soil tested if we were growing in raised beds? I would say yes. And I recommend that you do an initial soil testing. And what you would do with that is address your fertility. And if it wasn't really far off, then I would say you can check every 2 or 3 years. But if you really had deficient soil, like I showed you in the picture that I showed, I would probably test maybe 2 years in a row. And then when I get it closer to where I like it, I check about every 3 years. And then how often should I water when I'm starting seeds indoors? I like to water about once a week. But it really depends on how big your plants are. And then it depends on how big the pot is. So when you start them in, say, a cell pack, that's roughly a 1 inch, 1 by 1 inch cube. And when that seedling is a baby seedling, until it gets probably its first 2, 3, 4 true leaves, you're probably okay watering it once a week, assuming you're not in a really dry place. Once it starts to grow, and as soon as it starts to fill up that soil volume, remember the soil holds the water, and if the plant grows and fills up that cell pack with roots, there's no soil left in there, and you're watering too frequently. And so if you have it in a decent sized pot and it's not too big, you would water maybe once a week or so. But when they're rapidly growing, especially if they're filling up that pot, use your best judgment. And you might need to be watering much more frequently. Try to avoid them being pot bound. If you need to pot up your plants into bigger pots, feel free to do so. All right, Julie says, I live in Columbus, Ohio. Go Bucks. I have not started my brassicas indoors yet. Is it too late? Can I direct sow them? So I would say, Julie, of our brassicas, I would say that you could start kale and you could start mustard, and you could start bok choy inside. You could try your cauliflower. You could definitely do some of the faster broccolis, and you could try Brussels sprouts. If you're going to do those three, I would find varieties that mature faster. And then you can direct sow all of your leafy brassicas, all of your root veggie brassicas, like your radishes and your turnips. They're going to go out here pretty soon. And then if you don't feel like starting your broccolis, because the thing is if we do have a warmer spring, like the predictive models have shown for here in Columbus, Ohio, you can put a late planting of broccoli and cauliflower out. And if the heat hits it before it's induced to start making that edible head, then sometimes they don't actually turn into a head because of the heat. So if you're going to start some from seed, you might want to protect yourself by grabbing a 6-pack if that's a real important crop for you to put out a bigger transplant. Kay Allen says, how do we keep radishes from flowering? Good luck with April plantings, but later fall plantings have often flower heads and little to no radish. So radishes actually really do like that cold weather. I would say that for your April, so you're going to be fine with March and April plantings. I do find that if I plant them later on, when the sun, if it's really hot and we get a lot of sun, they do the same thing, and I get flower heads and little to no radish. Make sure you thin. Make sure you don't over fertilize with nitrogen. They need a little bit, but not a lot. You'll get too many leaves and not enough radish when you do that planting, regardless of when you plant it. I've actually used 30% shade fabric to knock down the sunlight on mine to extend my radish planting deeper into the season, if that's something you've got familiarity, comfort, or would like to try. And then I will plant my fall radishes. Actually, I don't generally seed start them indoors. If we have a warmer fall, I can have the same problems that you're seeing as the warm weather hits. It depends on our weather. I would do plantings every week in order to maximize your harvest of radishes, because the nice thing is when you harvest a radish and you get them inside, get the field heat off them and get them rinsed and in the fridge, they will keep for weeks, if not a month or so. And so I would go heavy on earlier plantings and harvesting, and then storage indoors. Okay, Colleen says, what do you do to prevent the deer from dining? Pretty much in an urban environment, you have fence, and that is what you have. In my community garden, I will put a temporary 7-foot deer fence, because if I don't, nuisance wildlife will eat all of my stuff. We have a tremendous problem with nuisance wildlife in an urban environment. Now, if you want to try repellents, you can try them, but you have to apply constantly on there, because if rainfall washes them off and the deer find your stuff, they will just hammer it and then come back and hammer it more. I've had limited success with using it's the motion detector things that sprinkle water and will shoot water when they detect a deer coming into the environment. Deer will get used to the radius of it, so I do move that periodically. And you do have to leave a hose on and have it connected, and it's battery powered. So if the battery turns off, you might lose your stuff. So I found good success with fence. Fences make good neighbors, as they say. So what kind of season extenders do you use? I do use row cover. I will use plastic only in emergency cold and throw it over row cover, because plastic can just heat up so fast in there. For overwintered protection, I like frost blanket, something probably closer to a 1.5 ounce per yard. My favorite all purpose would be about 1.2 ounce. I will have some medium sized ones. I used to use the lightweight row cover for an insect barrier, but they actually make really, really nice fine mesh insect barrier that's much tougher than lightweight row cover, because lightweight row cover will rip on you. So I like at least 1.2 ounce frost blanket, or a little heavier for my overwintered stuff. And thank you. It was a great presentation. I appreciate you, but it was delivered at lightning speed. Yes, I talk like I'm an auctioneer trying to get a sale in the sale barn, and I'm sorry about that. I try to get as much information as I can, and I really want to get through all the questions. So the nice thing is Angie recorded this, and that is going to be posted and hosted online, and then you will get a recording of this, and on YouTube, it will transcribe it, and good luck YouTube transcriber trying to keep up with me, but we will have a link that we can share with you so that you can review it at your leisure. Okay, Alice says, can you use a grow light with variable hours, like 10 hours one day, 6 hours another, and maybe just window light when it's sunny? Alice, I would not recommend that because plants, when they are exposed to variable lighting, that might induce them to move from vegetative to reproductive, and that might be something that induces them and stresses them out. They like light to be sort of mimicking the sun, and transitions from the sun are very gradual. So I would say if you're going to use your light, you would set it for the amount of time that that plant likes. All right, anonymous attendee says, what are your thoughts on square foot gardening and the soil mix they recommend? I love square foot gardening in terms of the spacing of it. And if you find an original square foot gardening book from Mel Bartholomew going back like 30 years ago, he didn't do his soil mix. He just gardened and he used the spacing method. I'm not a huge fan of the vermiculite, peat moss, and compost, only for the cost, quite honest. But if the budget is there for you, basically what that square foot gardening method is closer to a container gardening method at that point. So I'm a huge fan of the square foot gardening method in terms of how it will use very efficient spacing to make sure that you space correctly, get a great harvest, you don't overplant, you plant correctly. If you have money in the budget for vermiculite, peat moss, and compost, go for it. I do recommend that if you are filling containers and you're filling raised beds up for the first time, that you would go with the best mix that you can fit in your budget. Melissa Fannin, how are you, miss? I haven't seen you in a month of Sundays. Do I ever make my own seed tapes for carrots or radishes? I don't, but I do when I go to a school and we do what's known as paper towel planting. And with paper towel planting, what we'll do with kids is we will take a paper towel and we'll grid it out so that we have everything spaced out by about 3 inches by 3 inches. And we put a little tiny dab of like Elmer's or other water soluble glue in it. And we put a radish seed or a carrot seed or a pea seed or cilantro or something like that in there. And then we have the kids lay the paper towels down and sprinkle dirt over it at the appropriate depth and then water it in, and that pre-spaces out the plants. So Abby asks, have you had luck with bug netting and cabbage whites? Yes, I have. And so there are great netting products that are out there, and I use them for protection, mostly with my cucurbits, quite honestly, because I have a good spray that I can use for my cabbage, or I have a good spray that I can use for my imported cabbage worm for cabbage whites, although quite honestly, bug netting would be a great option because you wouldn't have to put anything on there. I will use that for my cucurbit pests as well, for my squash bugs and for my squash vine borers and my cucumber beetles. You just got to make sure you get that on there right away, because the last thing you would want would be to put the netting on there and trap one of those predators inside your garden where you've just protected them from external predators and you put them in with the food. And Stephanie asks, any advice for keeping squirrels out of the garden? And quite honestly, that is where I like that insect netting. Quite honestly, insect netting is a fairly effective nuisance wildlife protection from birds, from squirrels, and from deer, believe it or not, from bunnies, but not from groundhogs. They will eat right through anything and they will eat all of your food insect netting or row cover to them is a very mild annoyance and no more than that.
That was amazing. Those were such great questions, everyone. I think that really helped to supplement everything in there. Oh, we got one more that came in.
All right. Yeah, we got time for one more. Anonymous attendee, what's your experience in planting into arborist wood chips? Okay, so I get questions about using wood chips as mulch, and I'm a huge fan of mulch. I use organic mulches like straw or hay. I use inorganic mulches. I like plasticulture. I like the woven plasticulture, such as like a Sunbelt landscape fabric, because it's woven, it lets air and water go through, which is important, right? Soil root volume needs that in there. If I am counseling somebody and they're using wood chips as a mulch, That's not a bad thing, but don't incorporate them into the soil. If you're going to use them as mulch at the end of the season, rake them, pick them up, move them or whatever, just don't rototill them in, because the problem would be they're huge chunks of carbon. And once that carbon is incorporated in the soil, the bacteria that's in there are going to need to break that down, and they will tie up the nitrogen to do that, just like a compost pile. And then that nitrogen will not be available to the plants. So if you use it as a mulch, it's a great mulch, but don't incorporate it in there or else you will have a problem.
Abby just had a final comment for you. Thank
Thanks,
you so
Abby.
much.
Go Bucks. OH.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think we all learned a lot. And for everyone who registered, we will be sending out a link to where the recording is going to be housed. So you can listen to this and write down all the tips again and all the tricks for living your best garden life this spring. We really are so thrilled to be continuing this series. And you do have a link in the chat for the summer garden webinar. We hope to see you there. Spread the word to your family and friends and colleagues, because I think we all got a couple of pointers we can use to make sure that we're living our best garden life together. Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to everyone who attended today. I can't wait until the next time we connect. Thanks, everyone.